Have you ever wondered how quickly a person's body cools down in a bathtub filled with fresh hot water? Strange question, I know. But sometimes the basic laws of physics become the most important witnesses in a case where the person responsible seemed to have planned every detail and erased every trace. Today we're breaking down a case where what looked like the perfect plan was ultimately undone by thermodynamics. And by the end of this story, a lot of people may see those who wear a badge and swear to protect us in a very different light. Let's start with the documented timeline. January 29th, 2021. The small town of Kamaya, Idaho. A woman named Kendi Howard is rushing to prepare her last will and testament. She's at her parents' house after driving nearly 3 hours to get there. Kendi had fled her own home. She was convinced she didn't have much time left and believed her own husband was planning to take her life. Drafting those legal documents wasn't paranoia. It was a desperate attempt to protect her son and daughter in the face of what she believed was a very real threat. Now, fast forward exactly 4 days. February 2nd, 2021. Just before midnight. A large private estate sits on nearly 10 acres of land in the town of Athol, Idaho. At 10:43 p.m., emergency dispatch receives a frantic call. On the line is Daniel Howard, Kendi's husband. He's yelling, his voice cracking with emotion. He tells the dispatcher that he had gone upstairs and found his wife unresponsive. According to Daniel, she had taken her own life by shooting herself in the bathroom. Deputies arrive at the property without delay. At first glance, everything appears to support Daniel's account. Kendi is lying naked in the bathtub. A .380 caliber handgun rests on the bottom of the tub. She has a fatal gunshot wound to the head. Investigators also know the couple was in the middle of a bitter divorce, and Kendi had been preparing paperwork to divide their property. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward case of self-inflicted harm. A clean explanation. One that could have closed the investigation quickly. But the moment Deputy Sheriff Miranda Thomas begins examining the scene, that initial theory starts falling apart. Let's take a closer look at the details that immediately caught investigators' attention. Daniel, a man who had supposedly just lost his wife, is lying on the floor, twisting in apparent anguish. He's breathing heavily, acting as if he's about to vomit from shock, and making loud, sobbing sounds. But there's one problem. There isn't a single tear on his face. His eyes are completely dry. Then there's something else. The smell. Instead of smelling like someone drenched in stress and sweat, Daniel smells like fresh soap. On his dark clothing, deputies notice bright white streaks from what appears to be freshly applied deodorant. The man who says he had just discovered his wife's blood-covered body looks and smells as if he had stepped out of the shower only minutes earlier. Investigators continue processing the scene. The handgun found at the bottom of the bathtub does, in fact, belong to Kendi. It had been taken from the family's gun safe. The water surrounding her body is only slightly cloudy, with almost no visible blood. Then investigators notice the one detail that makes no sense at all. The bathwater is hot. Steam is still rising from it. But when crime scene technicians touch Kendi's body, they're caught completely off guard. Her body is ice cold. From a physics standpoint, that simply doesn't add up. A person could not have ended their own life in a tub of hot water and become completely cold before the water itself had cooled. The only explanation that fits the evidence is that someone placed an already cold body into a freshly drawn hot bath in an attempt to stage the scene. So how did Kendi predict her own death 4 days before that gunshot? Why did her husband smell freshly showered and covered in cologne when first responders arrived? And most importantly, who were detectives really dealing with that night inside the Athol mansion? To answer those questions, we have to go back and look at the past of a man who for years seemed untouchable. To understand who the justice system was really up against, we need to rewind about a decade and look behind the picture-perfect image everyone else saw. Daniel wasn't just an ordinary citizen. He was a former United States Marine and a highly trained police officer. He served as a firearms instructor for a special weapons and tactics unit. His job was to train other officers in the use of deadly force, evaluate ballistic evidence, and secure crime scenes. He understood police investigations from the inside out, right down to the smallest procedures and every line of an official report. From the outside, the Howard family looked like the definition of success. Together, they owned real estate and other assets worth more than $2 million. But behind the doors of that expensive home, life was run like a dictatorship. The former Marine controlled every single dollar, following one simple rule: my money is my money, and your money is mine too. His obsession with saving money reached the point of absurdity. Winters in northern Idaho are brutally cold, with temperatures regularly dropping well below freezing. Even so, Daniel refused to let anyone turn on the electric heat. The entire house was heated with nothing but a wood-burning stove. Kendi and their son and daughter, Brooke and Wyatt, lived in constant cold, while the head of the household sat on bank accounts worth millions. The financial control was matched by constant humiliation. Daniel regularly belittled Kendi's intelligence and openly mocked her appearance. It's hard to keep your footing when your own home starts feeling more like a military barracks than a place where you're supposed to feel safe. Years of relentless stress and total control eventually took a serious toll on Kendi's health. As one of the few coping mechanisms available to her, she developed an eating disorder that led to compulsive overeating. Kendi's physician officially documented the condition and prescribed her a low dose of Prozac. Her medical records now included documentation confirming that she was experiencing severe emotional exhaustion. Now let's look at how the justice system itself helped create Daniel's sense that he could get away with almost anything. In 2011, while on traffic patrol, Daniel opened fire on a vehicle he had pulled over. When it was over, the woman behind the wheel had lost her life, and the passenger had suffered critical injuries. An internal police investigation completely cleared Daniel of wrongdoing. The review board concluded that his actions were influenced by the stress of the job, allowing him to keep both his badge and his service weapon. 3 years later, in 2014, the pressure inside the marriage finally spilled into the open. Exhausted by years of isolation, Kendi began a relationship with a local man named Matthew Wood. Daniel's response was unlike anything most people would expect. He essentially began hunting down his rival. Using his marked patrol vehicle, he repeatedly followed Matthew wherever he went. He openly threatened him, promising to kill him. He deliberately damaged Matthew's property, and the conflict eventually reached an even more disturbing level. One night, Daniel drove to Matthew's house, pulled out a shotgun, and fired multiple rounds into the roof of the home. If an ordinary citizen had carried out an armed attack, stalked someone, and destroyed their property, the consequences would almost certainly have been severe. But in this case, something often referred to as the blue wall of silence came into play, an unwritten tradition in which law enforcement officers protect one another. The local prosecutor's office, which worked closely with police every day, agreed to an extraordinary plea deal. The former special weapons and tactics instructor received just 120 days in jail. Even more surprising The state police allowed him to resign voluntarily instead of being publicly fired in disgrace. He walked out of jail 4 months later, kept his social standing, and remained eligible for a substantial law enforcement pension. Rather than holding him fully accountable, the system had shown him that the rules seemed to work differently for someone wearing a badge. By the summer of 2020, life inside the house had taken another dangerous turn. Daniel discovered several credit cards that Kendi had secretly opened. The moment he realized he was losing control over the family's finances, he reacted with extreme aggression. He grabbed Kendi by the neck and choked her. She managed to photograph the bruises afterward and secretly sent the pictures to a close friend. From that point on, Kendi began quietly and methodically gathering evidence she could use in the upcoming divorce proceedings. In the fall of that same year, Kendi finally sees a real chance to get out. Her brother, Brian, helps Daniel land a high-paying job on Alaska's oil fields. The schedule is rotational, 3 weeks working in Alaska, followed by 3 weeks back home. While Daniel is thousands of miles away from Idaho, Kendi quietly puts her escape plan into motion. She hires a real estate agent to secretly purchase a home of her own. That agent turns out to be Daniel Prado, her first love from high school. The two reconnect and eventually begin a relationship. For the first time in years, Kendi has a clear goal: recover the money that legally belongs to her and start over somewhere else. On January 28, 2021, Daniel returns home from another work rotation. While they're still in the car after leaving the airport, Kendi tells him she wants a divorce. His reaction is so alarming that she immediately calls her mother, who contacts law enforcement to request a welfare check. When deputies arrive, their body cameras capture a striking contrast. Kendi is visibly shaking with fear. Daniel, meanwhile, is sitting calmly on the couch, completely relaxed, chatting with fellow officers as if nothing is wrong. Without legal grounds to make an arrest, the deputies leave. That same night, Kendi suddenly wakes up. In the darkness of the bedroom, she sees Daniel standing over her. He's dressed entirely in black. He's wearing latex gloves, and he's gripping a pillow tightly in his hands. On the floor beside him lies a fully loaded pistol magazine. The moment Daniel realizes she's awake, he quietly backs away. It seems clear that resistance was never part of whatever plan he had in mind. Terrified, Kendi leaves the house and goes straight to her parents. Think about how calculated this was. No yelling, no direct threats, just latex gloves and a pillow in the middle of the night. If someone wanted to make a death during sleep appear natural, it would be difficult to imagine a method that left fewer obvious clues. Then, on February 1st, everything changes. Brian is riding in the same vehicle with Daniel. During the drive, the former police officer begins aggressively questioning his brother-in-law. And Brian makes one critical mistake. He openly admits that Kendi isn't just leaving the marriage. She's buying a new home with the help of her real estate agent, Daniel Prado, the man she's now involved with. For Daniel, that revelation is devastating. His wife isn't only preparing to claim her legal share of their assets, she's also building a new life with another man, someone who's helping her move forward while the divorce is underway. To Daniel, it's a humiliation he has no intention of accepting. The very next day, February 2nd, Kendi decides to return to the house one last time. She urgently needs the original financial documents required to complete the purchase of her new home. Before going inside, she tells Daniel Prado that her husband had nearly been caught a couple of nights earlier, so she believes he wouldn't dare do anything out in the open now. Kendi walks back through the front door of her home, unaware that the former police officer is already inside, waiting for her, fully prepared to settle things his own way. Now let's go back to the mansion on the night of February 2nd, when deputies and crime scene investigators filled the house. Daniel confidently gives investigators his version of what happened. He says that after an argument, Kendi went upstairs to take a bath while he stayed on the first floor. Sometime later, he claims he heard a dull thud from upstairs, as if a heavy dictionary had fallen onto the floor. He says he went to check and found Kendi unresponsive. Do you hear how quickly that story starts falling apart? Daniel claims he heard the sound of a body hitting the floor through the structure of a large house. But somehow, he never heard the deafening sound of a handgun being fired, even though the bathroom door was standing wide open. Later, Daniel's own father testifies under oath that his son is completely deaf in one ear. So how does a former firearms instructor suddenly have such remarkably selective hearing? While Daniel tells investigators this carefully crafted story, detectives continue searching the house. And the house itself seems to tell a completely different story. In the master bedroom, investigators find broken glass scattered across the floor. Personal belongings are thrown everywhere. Pieces of torn clothing are recovered. Everything points to a desperate struggle. People don't normally tear a room apart before voluntarily ending their own life. Now let's head downstairs. Near the front entrance, investigators find a packed Victoria's Secret travel bag. Inside are personal belongings neatly prepared for a trip. Kendi hadn't returned to the house to stay. She had come back to collect important documents before leaving. She was making plans for the next day. But some of the most important witnesses in this case aren't people at all. They're household appliances. That night, the massive wood-burning stove had been pushed to maximum heat, turning the house into something that felt more like a sauna. Exactly what was burned inside that furnace, whether it was evidence, blood-stained items, or something else, is something investigators may never know for certain. Then detectives make another discovery in the laundry room. The washing machine is still running. It's completely filled with towels. Detective Northrup has an idea. He contacts the appliance manufacturer to determine exactly how the machine's timer works. The engineers provide an answer that completely dismantles Daniel's timeline. The wash cycle had started exactly 1 minute before Daniel placed his call to emergency dispatch. That means he had roughly 2 hours between Kendi's death and the moment he called for help. Plenty of time to clean the floors, remove evidence, and throw blood-stained towels into the washing machine before picking up the phone. Later, at the sheriff's office, the former tactical officer begins to lose his composure. When investigators tell Daniel they're about to collect samples from his hands to test for gunshot residue, he suddenly panics. Right in front of his former colleagues, he shoves both hands into his pockets and starts rubbing them frantically against the fabric of his pants, apparently trying to wipe away any remaining particles. The deputies shout at him to stop, but by then, the damage is already done. The test comes back negative. At this point, you'd probably expect an immediate arrest. After all those contradictions, what else could happen? But that's not what happened. Once again, the system stepped in. Kendi's body was sent for an autopsy to a medical examiner named John Howard. Despite the shared last name, the two men were not related. Dr. Howard, who had already been under investigation by the local health department for years over allegations of professional negligence, conducted the examination. What happened next is remarkable. He never read the preliminary police reports. He never reviewed the crime scene photographs. Instead, he accepted the working theory presented to him and listed the cause of death as undetermined. To understand the track record of this medical examiner, consider this. In an earlier case, he ruled the death of a young woman whose body had been found dismembered in a forest as undetermined. In another investigation, he accepted the explanation that a woman had died in an accidental shooting, while her husband was supposedly cleaning a firearm. Because of that extraordinary lack of thoroughness, Daniel walked out of the sheriff's office a free man. The former police officer spent the next 2 full years living without charges. What he didn't realize was that it's much harder to fool biology than it is to fool someone with a medical degree. For 2 years, Kendi's family fought an exhausting battle against the system. They refused to accept the conclusion that the cause of her death was simply undetermined. Under relentless pressure from her family, the investigation was finally reopened. This time, an independent team of forensic experts took over. Their job wasn't just to review the case file, it was to reconstruct, piece by piece, exactly what had happened inside that mansion. And this time, science delivered a devastating blow to the former tactical officer's carefully crafted story. Let's look at how human physiology completely dismantled the theory that Kendi had ended her own life. The first question the independent pathologists asked was straightforward. If she had fired the gun herself, why were there no injuries consistent with damage to her airway? The new examination found her trachea completely intact. Her hyoid bone was also undamaged. At the same time, investigators documented more than 30 bruises across her body and determined that her jaw had been fractured by blunt force trauma. The answer, they concluded, was connected to Daniel's professional training. Experts determined that Kendi had likely been placed in an LVNR hold. LVNR, or lateral vascular neck restraint, is a specialized control technique taught primarily to law enforcement officers and military personnel. The purpose of the hold isn't to crush the throat or block the airway. Instead, it compresses the carotid arteries on both sides of the neck. Blood flow to the brain is interrupted, causing a person to lose consciousness within seconds, while leaving far fewer of the classic signs associated with manual strangulation. It was a method that fit the skill set of an experienced police instructor. Next came the forensic analysis of the gunshot wound and the blood evidence. Dr. Jennifer Nara, who conducted the independent review, focused on the trajectory of the bullet. It entered through the center of Kendi's tongue, traveled downward, and came to rest in her cervical vertebrae. The tongue is made almost entirely of muscle and contains an extensive network of blood vessels. If Kendi's heart had still been pumping normally when that shot was fired, the wound would have produced an enormous amount of bleeding. The bathtub should have filled with blood almost immediately. But as we've already seen, the water was only slightly cloudy. The scientific conclusion is unmistakable. By the time the bullet passed through Kendi's body, her heart was no longer beating. The gunshot was inflicted after her death as part of an effort to stage the scene. And now, we finally come back to the temperature mystery we talked about at the very beginning. How could Kendi's body be ice cold while the water around her was still steaming hot? The answer comes from gravity, more specifically from livor mortis, also known as post-mortem lividity. Once the heart stops, blood is no longer circulating. Gravity causes it to settle into the lowest parts of the body, creating dark discoloration beneath the skin. Deputies found Kendi sitting upright in the bathtub. If she had died in that position, lividity would have developed primarily in her lower legs and pelvic area. But the forensic findings showed something completely different. The lividity was located almost entirely across her back. There was another critical detail. Investigators found dried blood on Kendi's face. The streaks had flowed upward toward her forehead. Think about what those two medical findings actually tell us. The timeline of that night suddenly becomes remarkably clear. It begins with a violent struggle in the upstairs bedroom. Furniture is damaged, glass is shattered. At some point, Daniel applies a specialized neck restraint, leaving Kendi unresponsive on the floor. After that, he leaves her body lying flat on her back for several hours. He waits. He waits for gravity to permanently fix the lividity across her back. He waits for her body temperature to drop completely. Only then does the former special weapons and tactics instructor fill the bathtub with fresh hot water. He removes Kendi's clothing, carries her body into the tub, positions her upright, and fires a single shot into her head using her own handgun while wearing latex gloves. Then he drops the weapon into the bottom of the bathtub. It was an elaborate plan, one that unraveled because its creator overlooked the laws of physics and the behavior of human blood after death. Science had demonstrated that this was a crime. Now prosecutors had to prove it to a jury. In April 2023, the former tactical officer was finally placed under arrest. Do you think he was taken straight to jail? Not quite. He posted $1.5 million in bail, using money that prosecutors said had come from Kendi's estate. The court allowed him to return home under electronic monitoring, wearing a GPS ankle monitor. Then, in the spring of 2024, the trial finally began. The defense presented a theory that many people found difficult to believe. Attorneys argued that the more than 30 bruises on Kendi's body had been caused by an accidental fall near a boat. Then, on March 15th, after it became increasingly clear that the forensic evidence was destroying his defense, Daniel tried to leave. Late that night, he drove toward Spokane International Airport with a handgun under the driver's seat. And here's the irony. A former law enforcement officer attempted to flee while still wearing a GPS ankle monitor that was transmitting his location in real time. He was stopped near the airport terminal. The following morning, his attorney told the judge that Daniel had simply been looking for a friend in the airport parking lot. The judge wasn't convinced. His bail was revoked. By the way, if you want to understand the true extent of Daniel's greed, consider what he did in the days immediately after Kendi's death. He canceled her order for a hot tub just to recover the deposit. On what would have been Kendi's birthday, he held a sale to get rid of her belongings. When his stepdaughter tried to buy a few glass figurines for Kendi's granddaughter, he had law enforcement remove her from the property. In the end, the case came down to one verdict. On May 23, 2024, Daniel was sentenced to life in prison. Under Idaho's Slayer statute, he was stripped of any legal right to inherit or benefit from Kendi's estate. The millions passed instead to her son and daughter. The man who had spent years controlling every single dollar ended up with nothing more than a prison uniform and empty pockets.